Hi, everyone. Next in our series on self-report measures, we'll be looking at measures that are used for other mental health disorders, including trauma, OCD, and so on. As I've mentioned with the other videos, if you haven't already watched the introduction and general measures, I recommend you start there. And there are also videos about anxiety and depressive disorders if you're interested in those. But here, we'll be focusing on other mental health disorders. I'll start with ADHD measures, and there are varieties shown here on this list, but I'll only be giving you information about the measure that I personally have access to, which is the ADHD self-report scale. So here it is. This measure is an 18-item self-report measure that assesses for common symptoms of ADHD. Numbers are assigned to each symptom, to each response, never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often. With never being 0, rarely being 1, and so on until you get to very often, which would be 5. So for example, if someone selected sometimes for number 1, that would correspond to an assigned score of 2. You would then sum up the scores, with higher scores being indicative of a higher endorsement of ADHD symptoms. Beyond that, it's fairly straightforward, easy to complete. Okay. Oh, one quick thing. This one is asking about symptoms in the past 6 months, which is helpful to remember. Okay, next we have 2 measures of obsessive-compulsive symptoms, and I have access to both of these, so I'll be going over both of them. First is the Clark-BECK Obsessive-Compulsive Inventory, which consists of 25 questions that are split into 2 subscales, which you may have guessed, obsessions and compulsions. After the client takes the measure, you would then add up the scores into 3 subscales, and I'll show you the scoring in a moment. You can see that the number that is corresponding to each is provided right next to it, so that makes scoring a lot easier. And it's looking at never, rarely, occasionally, frequently, very frequently, and so on. So here's the scoring. There's an obsession subscale, a compulsion subscale, and a total score. Each one gives you a severity rating for that particular category. So for obsessions, you would add up the obsession items, for compulsions, the compulsion items, and total, obviously, everything all together. This is definitely one that you would follow up with a clinical interview to get more details about the specific obsessions, specific compulsions, and the impairments associated with them. Next is the Yale Brown Obsessive-Compulsive Symptom Checklist, the Y-BOCS. And this is a measure that the clinician completes, so not a self-report measure. Similar to the Hamilton measures we looked at for depression and anxiety. You would assess the client in each of these areas and then score the measure. Its purpose is more so to identify symptoms as opposed to talk about severity. So for severity, you could use the Yale Brown Obsessive-Compulsive Scale, which I'll go through next. If you're just looking to count symptoms in a sense, this is helpful. And again, can be used in your clinical interview by asking things that are listed here. So for fear might harm self, have you ever experienced fear that you might harm yourself, right? And so on. Okay. So this one here is looking at the, excuse me, I lost my train of thought for a second there. This is a 10-item questionnaire that's looking at severity, okay, of this specific symptom. So whereas the other one was just looking at presence of symptoms, this one is looking at severity of symptoms from none to extreme, okay? And you are scoring it from 0 to 4, as you can see listed there. It gives you the scores for you, okay? You would then sum up the scores, and then it gives you a severity rating of subclinical, mild, moderate, severe, or extreme, which again, I highly recommend you follow up on with your clinical interview. Okay. Next are the measures for assessing trauma. The majority of these are not intended to give you a score for trauma symptoms, but rather to screen for various trauma exposures. So has the client experienced these particular types of traumatic events? I'll be walking you through the brief trauma questionnaire and the trauma history questionnaire, which are for screening traumatic events. And then I'll take you through the PTSD checklist, which is actually looking for symptoms of PTSD. So they both serve different purposes, both provide really helpful information. The traumatic event screening inventory is a structured interview for trauma screening in children. And it has things that basically prompts that you could use to assess for trauma. So for example, one of the prompts is, I'm going to ask you about some things that might happen to kids. We'll talk about a bunch of other things that may have happened to you, but right now I want to know the things that were the scariest things that have ever happened to you. And if I ask you something that you don't want to talk about, that's okay. Just say pass, okay? And then you would go on. All right. So here is the brief trauma questionnaire. It asks yes or no for the experience of various traumatic experiences. First, have you ever experienced it? Then, did you think your life was in danger? And were you injured? Was the last piece, okay? So you see the 3 columns. Each of these will indicate a certain level of intensity and risk. It is then your job as the clinician to assess further about what those experiences were like and which associated symptoms occurred because of it. So this is asking, have you experienced this thing? Did you think your life was in danger if you did? Were you injured if you experienced it? And that's it. It's not asking about symptoms like nightmares and avoidance and so on associated with that event. That becomes your job. And so because of that, there's no scoring really. You could add up and see how many traumatic events the client experienced, but it's going to be more useful to just help you see what they've experienced and then assess further from there. Okay. Similarly, this one here, the trauma history questionnaire, is asking again yes or no about exposures to different potentially traumatic events and should be followed up with a clinical interview. So you can see number 1, has anyone ever tried to take something directly from you by using force or the threat of force, such as a stick-up or mugging? They would circle yes or no. And if yes, how many times and about how old were they? You then would go through them, look at the ones that they said yes for, and assess further in your clinical interview. Okay, finally, this is the PTSD checklist. And this is a 17-item measure that asks about symptoms of PTSD, such as trouble falling asleep, hypervigilance, and avoidance. So this one is actually looking at symptoms of PTSD as opposed to screening for traumatic event experiences. The client is instructed to circle one of the numbers to indicate how much they've been bothered by each symptom in the past month. So for number 1, how often have they been bothered by repeated disturbing memories, thoughts, or images of the stressful experience? 1, not at all the way up to 5, extremely. And then you would sum it up and get a rating of symptom severity. Okay, that's that. So that is it for our other measures. In the next video, I will be walking you through how to write up a report after your client has completed the self-report measures. So let me know if you have any questions about any of these, and I will see you next time. Thank you.